The splintered grey wood of the top box smelled of dust and old honey, a ghost of sweetness baked in by a decade of sun. Anna worked her fingers under the warped edge, grunting with the effort. The wood was heavier than it looked, dense with rain and neglect. Behind her, the pile Henderson wanted to burn crackled with dry grass and kindling, the heat already a living thing against her back. If you're just joining us, let us know in the comments what project you've been putting off. We find stories like this help get the gears turning. Henderson stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mask of impatient pity. He was a man who saw the world in terms of use and waste, and this mountain of rotting B. Langstroths, was squarely in the latter category. Anna, I appreciate you wanting to help clear the deadfall, but this is just trash. It's full of wax moth and foul brood spores, likely. Best to let it burn clean. She finally got the box loose and hugged it to her chest, the rough wood snagging on her canvas sleeve. It was a clumsy, desperate embrace. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on the pile, on the dozen other boxes she could save before the flames got hungry. I can use them, she said. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the hiss of the growing fire. Use them for what? Firewood. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. You've got a whole woodlot for that. This stuff will just smoke and stink. She shook her head, still not meeting his eyes. Not for firewood. She turned and began the slow walk back to her buckboard, the heavy box digging into her arms. The air was thick with the coming smoke, an acrid smell that promised erasure. To Henderson, and to everyone else in the valley, that was a good thing. An ending. A cleaning. To Anna, it felt like a threat. Another ending she couldn't afford. She heaved the box onto the wagon bed, where it landed with a hollow thud next to 3 others she'd already rescued. She could feel his stare on her back, the weight of his judgment. He thought she was mad with grief, the widow of the quiet rancher who died too young, now clinging to other men's garbage. He didn't understand. None of them did. They saw broken wood. She saw a skeleton that just needed life breathed back into it. She worked for 3 days, a solitary figure moving between the ranches that dotted the valley floor. The word had gotten around. Henderson's story, told over coffee at the general store, had painted her as an object of sad curiosity. The widow gathering trash. Most of the ranchers were happy to be rid of the old hives. They were upgrading to newer, cleaner equipment, and the stacks of abandoned boxes were just an eyesore, a monument to colonies that had failed. They pointed her to boneyards behind barns, to stacks collapsing into the tall grass, grey wood turning green with moss. She took them all. Her buckboard groaned under the weight. Back at her ranch, the one that was hers and not hers, the one still thick with the silence her husband had left behind, she built a mountain of her own. A teetering, chaotic pile of splintered supers, warp-bottom boards, and lid covers chewed by porcupines. It grew behind her small cabin, a testament to decay. Martha, who ran the store and had been a friend to her before the quiet fell, came out one afternoon with a parcel of salt pork and flour. She stood for a long time, looking at the pile of wood, then at Anna's face, smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat. Anna, she said, her voice gentle. What is all this for? Anna wiped her forehead with the back of a raw, splintered hand. A project. Martha's gaze was kind, but laced with the same worry Anna saw in everyone's eyes. Folks are talking. They're worried. They think you're not well. Anna looked at the mountain of wood. It was ugly. It was overwhelming. She knew what they saw. A mess. A symbol of a mind gone to ruin. Let them talk, she said, and the words felt solid in her own ears, even if they didn't convince her friend. The first step was triage. She spent a week just sorting, creating 3 piles. One for wood that was truly rotten, soft as wet paper, destined for her own cookstove. One for wood that was salvageable, cracked and weathered but still strong. And a third, the largest pile, for the pieces that were somewhere in between. She needed a teacher, or at least some advice. There was only one person who might understand, and he was less likely to offer help than a rattlesnake. Jebediah lived up a dry canyon, a place the sun baked into submission every summer. He'd kept bees for 50 years before his hands got too stiff and his temper too short. He hadn't sold his hives, he'd just let them die out, and now his own yard was a smaller, neater version of the boneyard she was building. She found him sitting on his porch, scraping a stick with a knife. He watched her approach, his eyes narrowed under a dusty hat brim. He didn't get up. She stood before the porch steps, feeling like a child asking for a favor. "Mr. Jebediah." "I'm Anna," he grunted. "I know who you are." She gestured vaguely back down the road, in the direction of her ranch. "I've collected some old hives. From the other ranches heard you were collecting garbage." His voice was like stones grinding together. "I want to fix them. I want to keep bees." He stopped scraping the stick and finally looked at her, a long, searching look that made her feel transparent. "That wood's poison. Full of moth, mite, and memory of every bad winter this valley's ever had. You can't put new bees in old death." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Go home, widow. Plant a garden." The dismissal was absolute. She stood there for a moment, the heat pressing down, the silence stretching. She should have turned and left. Instead, she said the only thing she could think of. They were going to burn it. Jebediah looked at his stick, then back at her. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Fire's clean," he said. "Sometimes it's the only way." He went back to his whittling. The conversation was over. She walked away with nothing but the dust on her boots and the sting of his words. The summer settled in, a heavy blanket of heat that shimmered over the fields. The work was brutal. Each box had to be scraped clean of the old, blackened wax and brittle cocoons left by generations of bees and moths. The smell was cloying, a mix of fermented honey, decay, and the faint, chalky scent of disease. She wore thick leather gloves, but the splinters still found their way into her skin, leaving a constellation of sore, red marks on her hands and forearms. She used a hive tool her husband had left in the barn, a small, sharp pry bar that became an extension of her hand. She pried apart frames glued tight with decades of propolis, a dark, sticky resin that smelled of sap and sunshine. It was slow, punishing labor under the relentless sun. The pile of salvaged wood grew, but the mountain of questionable pieces seemed to shrink at a glacial pace. A thunderstorm rolled through one afternoon, a violent, purple bruise of a storm that dropped hail the size of acorns. It battered the neat stacks of repaired wood she'd covered with canvas, but it turned the unsorted pile into a sodden, heavy mess, hastening the rot in the most damaged pieces. It felt like a setback, a sign from the heavens that she was engaged in a fool's errand. She spent the next 2 days laying the pieces out in the sun to dry, turning them over and over, her back aching. That night, sitting at her simple kitchen table, nursing her sore hands, the doubt was a physical weight in the room. Jebediah's words echoed in her mind. "Go home, widow. Plant a garden." Maybe he was right. Maybe this was just another way of wrestling with grief, a meaningless, exhausting task to keep from thinking about the emptiness of the house. But the next morning, she was back outside at dawn. The sun wasn't a curse, it was a tool. She remembered something Jebediah had said, almost as an afterthought. "Fire's clean." But what if the sun could do the same work? She began to arrange the cleaned, scraped boxes and frames in long, neat rows on the south-facing slope behind the cabin. Day after day, she left them there, letting the intense, high-altitude sun bake the wood. She turned them every few days, ensuring every surface, every corner, was exposed to the sterilizing ultraviolet light. The wood, once gray and lifeless, began to bleach to a pale, silvery white. It smelled clean, like dry dust and heat. The ghosts of the old hives were being exorcised by the sun. One morning, a wagon rattled up her lane. It was Jebediah. He didn't get down, just sat there, watching her work. She was fitting a repaired corner on a deep hive body, her hammer taps precise and steady. He watched for a full 5 minutes before he spoke. "Sun's a slow fire," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An observation. She nodded, not pausing in her work. "It seems to be," he grunted, a sound that might have been approval. "You're scorching the insides?" With a blowtorch. Just enough to blacken the wood, he nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the long rows of sun-bleaching boxes. He looked at her hands, calloused and stained. He looked at the sweat on her brow. He stayed for another 10 minutes, in complete silence, then clucked to his horse and rattled away. He hadn't offered any more advice. But he had come back. It was enough. That visit marked a subtle shift. He didn't become a friendly teacher, but his presence was felt. Sometimes she would find a small stack of usable cedar shakes on her porch, perfect for repairing lid covers, with no note to say where they came from. Once, a small tin of pine tar was left by the barn door, the exact thing she needed for waterproofing the bottom boards. He never announced his coming or going. The gifts were just there, like offerings from the landscape itself. With Jebediah's silent sanction, a new energy infused her work. She was no longer just cleaning, she was building. Her vision for the hives was beginning to take shape, and it was nothing like the neat, grid-like apiaries of her neighbors. On the windiest, most exposed hill on her property, a place where nothing but tough grasses grew, she began to lay a foundation of flat stones. The very place everyone else would avoid for bees. Henderson, riding his fence line one day, saw her hauling the stones and rode over. "Anna," he called out, reining in his horse. "That's the worst spot on this whole ranch for livestock. The winter wind comes through that gap like a razor. It'll freeze anything you put here solid." She set a heavy stone in place, her breath coming in pants. "It's for the hives," she said. He stared at the curving line of stones, then at the stacks of mismatched, repaired boxes waiting near the barn. He looked at her as if she'd just announced she was planning to fly. "You're going to put bees here? They'll be dead by November. The wind will tear the lids off. It will suck the heat right out of the clusters." She straightened up, wiping her hands on her trousers. "I have a plan." Her certainty seemed to annoy him more than her grief ever had. He shook his head, a look of genuine bewilderment on his face. "It's your time to waste, I suppose." He turned his horse and rode off, the message clear. He had tried to warn her. From that day on, her project became a piece of local folklore, a story told with shaking heads. The widow's folly. On her stone foundation, she began to place the hives. Not in rows, but in a deep, interlocking curve, like a section of a massive honeycomb. The boxes were set close together, some even touching. She began to stack them, not just with supers for honey, but with empty boxes, creating a solid, thick wall. A wall of beehives. It was 2, and in some places 3, hives deep. The entrances all faced south, into the curve, protected from the prevailing north wind. The back of the wall was a solid mass of wood, a fortress against the weather. Martha came again, this time with a jar of her own canned peaches. "It's big," she said, staring at the growing structure. The wall was now chest-high and nearly 50 feet long. "It's a windbreak," Anna explained. "The heat from all the colonies, trapped together, will help them share warmth. The outer hives will insulate the inner ones." And Martha looked skeptical. "Did your husband teach you this?" The question was innocent, but it pricked at something deep. "No," Anna said, her voice quiet but firm. "He didn't." This was hers. This strange, curving wall of salvaged wood, this unlikely fortress on a barren hill. It was born not of his memory, but of her own stubborn imagination. A quiet defiance she hadn't known she possessed. By late summer, the wall was complete. It was a strange and beautiful thing, a mosaic of weathered gray, bleached white, and the occasional patch of old, faded paint. It followed the contour of the hill, a crescent of wood against the golden grass. It looked ancient and purposeful, like the ruins of a forgotten settlement. Now, she needed bees. She had spent nearly all of her meager savings on nails, lumber for patches, and the few tools she didn't already own. She couldn't afford to buy established colonies. She had to start with swarms, the wild, unpredictable lifeblood of beekeeping. Jebediah showed up one morning, unannounced as always. He pointed with his chin toward a gnarled oak tree far up the canyon. "There's a bee tree up there. Been there for years. They'll be throwing swarms this month." He didn't offer to help. He just gave her the information. That was his way. Catching a swarm was a delicate, dangerous dance. It required patience and a steady nerve. Anna fashioned a simple swarm-catching basket on a long pole. For a week, she watched the bee tree. Finally, she saw it, a great, buzzing cloud of bees pouring from a hollow in the trunk, swirling in the air before settling on a low-hanging branch. The sound was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in her chest. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She carefully positioned the basket beneath the clustered bees and gave the branch a single, sharp jolt. The entire mass of bees, thousands of them, fell into the basket. She lowered it slowly, covered it with a canvas sheet, and carried her prize home. The first colony. She installed them in a hive at the center of her wall, the most protected spot. The bees, confused at first, quickly found the entrance and began to march inside, a golden river of life flowing into the heart of her creation. She spent the next 2 weeks catching 3 more swarms. Each one was a small victory, a validation of her work. She was no longer just a carpenter, she was a beekeeper. The wall was no longer just a structure, it was a home. The bee settled in, there buzzing a constant, low thrum on the windy hill. The sound of life. But it was late in the season. The fall nectar flow was weak, mostly goldenrod and late-season alfalfa. The colonies worked tirelessly, but they were building up their populations and drawing out new waxcomb, using most of the nectar they gathered for themselves. When she checked the hives in early October, the harvest was pitiful. From 4 hives, she took only a few frames of honey, barely enough to fill a dozen jars. It was dark, rich, and intensely flavorful, but it was a pittance. Martha looked at the small collection of jars on her counter at the general store. "Is this all?" she asked, her voice full of sympathy. Anna nodded. The story went around town. All that work, all summer long, for a dozen jars of honey. The shakes of the head were now tinged with a finality. The widow's folly had produced exactly what everyone expected. Nothing. The first frost came early that year, a silver blanket that crisped the dead grass and heralded the coming cold. Anna worked frantically to prepare the hives for winter. She made candy boards from hardened sugar, an emergency food source for the deep winter months. She checked each hive, ensuring the colonies were strong and clustered tightly. She reduced the entrances to small slits to keep mice out. Her work was a race against the dropping temperatures. The wall of hives, which had looked so strange and imposing in the summer sun, now seemed to her to be terribly exposed on its barren hill. Henderson's words haunted her. The winter wind comes through that gap like a razor. One afternoon, as a slate-gray sky threatened the first snow, Henderson himself rode up to her fence line. He didn't dismount. He just sat on his horse, looking at the bee wall. "The first blizzard is supposed to hit tomorrow night," he said. It wasn't a friendly warning, it was a pronouncement of doom. "You'd better hope that wall of yours is as clever as you think it is." "I hope so," she said quietly. "It's not just your bees, Anna," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "If those colonies die, and you don't clean out the hives properly, they become a disease reservoir. My hives are just down the valley. Your failure could cost me." The accusation hung in the cold air. She was not just a fool, she was a potential threat. A liability to the serious, productive ranchers around her. "I'll be responsible for them," she said, her chin held high. He snorted, a small cloud of vapor erupting from his nostrils. "We'll see." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving her alone with her fortress of wood and the vast, unforgiving sky. That night, the snow began to fall. It came down not as gentle flakes, but as a driving, horizontal blizzard, pushed by a relentless north wind. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, moaning in the chimney. Anna sat by her stove, listening. She couldn't see the hill, couldn't see the hives. She could only hear the fury of the wind, the very force her wall was meant to defy. All her work, all her hope, was out there in the dark, being tested by the worst the world could throw at it. Doubt, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced her heart. What if they were all right? What if she had built nothing more than a wooden tombstone for colonies of bees, a monument to her own stubborn pride? The wind howled its answer, and it sounded like laughter. The winter was one of the harshest in memory. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying fences and making the roads impassable for weeks at a time. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked the valley. Temperatures dropped far below zero and stayed there. The ranchers lost cattle. The townspeople huddled by their stoves, burning through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. For Anna, it was a season of profound solitude. Her world shrank to the cabin, the barn, and the snow-covered path between them. Once a week, when the wind died down, she would strap on her snowshoes and make the arduous trek up the hill to the apiary. She couldn't see the individual hives. The entire structure was buried in a massive snowdrift, a smooth, white whale beached on the hillside. The snow itself was an insulator, a blanket protecting the wood from the wind. But was there any life left inside? She would press her ear to the top of the drift, directly over where she knew a hive was located, and listen. Sometimes she heard nothing but the wind. Her heart would sink, a cold stone in her gut. But then, on a still, cold day, she would hear it. A faint, low, almost imperceptible hum. The sound of the winter cluster, the bees vibrating their wing muscles, generating heat, keeping their queen alive at the center of a living sphere. The sound was life. It was the faintest whisper of hope in a world of frozen silence. She would trudge back to her cabin, her spirit lifted just enough to face another week of isolation. She read her husband's old beekeeping books, learning about the subtle science of overwintering. She learned how a larger, shared thermal mass, like her wall, could reduce the energy expenditure of each individual colony. In theory, it should work. In theory, her bees had a better chance than Henderson's, whose individual hives stood like lonely sentinels in his field, exposed to the full force of the wind, their warmth leaching out into the frozen air. But theory was a fragile thing against the reality of a wind chill that could freeze a man solid in an hour. During a brief thaw in February, she saw Henderson in town. He looked tired, his face grim. "Lost 6 hives in that last cold snap," he muttered to the man behind the counter at the store. "Wind just scoured them clean." Froze solid, he glanced at Anna, who was buying flour. There was no triumph in his eyes, just a shared misery. He didn't ask about her bees. He assumed he already knew the answer. No one's bees could have survived that last cold snap on that windswept hill. Spring came late, reluctantly. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing a landscape that was bruised and battered. The valley floor was a sea of mud. As the great drift on her hill began to shrink, the top of her bee wall emerged, the wood dark with melted snow. Anna waited for a warm, sunny day, the kind of day when healthy bees would be taking their first cleansing flights after the long months of confinement. She walked up the hill, her boots sinking into the soft ground. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety. This was the moment of truth. As she got closer, she saw movement. A few dark specks, then a dozen, then more. Bees. They were flying from the entrances, circling in the pale spring sunlight. Not from just one hive, but from all 4. The entrances were busy, alive with bees carrying out the winter's dead, their tiny bodies dropping to the damp ground below. It was a sign of a strong, healthy colony, cleaning house, preparing for the season ahead. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She leaned against the wall, the wood warm from the sun, and closed her eyes, listening to the buzz. It was no longer a faint, desperate hum, but a confident, rising chorus. The sound of survival. The sound of victory. A few days later, Henderson rode up. He didn't stop at the fence this time. He rode right up the hill and dismounted, his boots squelching in the mud. He walked the length of the wall, peering at the busy entrances. He was silent for a long time. Anna stood by, waiting. "4," he said, finally. It wasn't a question. Alpha made it, she just nodded. He looked at the structure, really looked at it, for the first time. He saw the interlocking design, the thickness of the wall, the way the southern-facing curve would catch the winter sun. He saw the genius in what he had dismissed as madness. He ran a hand over the rough, salvaged wood of one of the boxes, one of his own, she remembered, from the burn pile. "I lost 12 colonies this winter," he said, his voice low. Out of 20 he looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw not pity or scorn, but a grudging, hard-won respect. He didn't apologize. Men like Henderson didn't use words for that. Instead, he reached into his little bag and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. "My wife sent you some bread," he said, holding it out to her. She took it. The gesture was more eloquent than any speech. It was an admission. An acknowledgement. He had been wrong. 2 years passed. The valley healed from the hard winter, and life went on. But something had changed. The story of the widow's folly was no longer told. In its place was a new story, the story of the bee wall. Anna's apiary had thrived. The 4 founding colonies had grown and swarmed, and she had populated more of the hives in the wall. The structure now housed more than 20 strong colonies. The unique microclimate she had created, combined with the sheer number of bees, produced a honey that was legendary. The shared genetics of the valley survivor bees, mixed and mingled in her apiary, created colonies that were hardy, productive, and resilient. Her honey harvest was no longer a dozen jars, but barrels of it. It was sold at a premium in the general store, and people came from the next county over to buy it. They didn't just come for the honey. They came to see the wall. It had become a local landmark. Other beekeepers, humbled by their own winter losses, came to ask her advice. They would stand before the wall, marveling at its simple, powerful logic. She never preached. She just explained what she had done, quietly and factually. She showed them how the waste of one person could become the foundation of another's success. She was no longer the widow, a figure of pity defined by her loss. She was Anna, the bee woman. Her name was synonymous with a quiet competence, a stubborn wisdom that saw value where others saw only trash. She had, piece by piece, box by box, built not just a wall, but a new life, a new identity, forged in the sun and tested by the wind. One warm summer evening, Jebediah came to sit with her on the hill overlooking the apiary. He was older now, more frail, but his eyes were still sharp. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the endless stream of bees returning to the wall, their legs heavy with yellow pollen. The air hummed with their labor. "You know," Jebediah said, his voice raspy, "my father used to say that any fool can buy something new. Takes a smart person to make something new out of something old." He looked at the long, curving wall, a mosaic of 100 stories, 100 failures, now united in one thriving, buzzing success. "Waste," he said, repeating the words he had spoken to her once, so long ago, though they meant something different now. "Waste is just a failure of imagination." Anna smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. She looked at the home she had built from garbage, the life she had nurtured from the edge of death. The sun was setting, casting a golden light on the wall, making it glow as if lit from within. It was a testament, not to what was lost, but to what could be reclaimed, repaired, and made to live again. If you found inspiration in Anna's story of seeing potential where others saw none, consider subscribing for more tales of quiet triumph and unexpected restoration.